Friends, welcome back to Cultural Savage. This week, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing you to Amie Waters. Amie is a musician and runs a YouTube channel where she mostly does cover songs from video games, TV shows, and movies. She also makes original music and composes music for anyone who needs it. And I'll tell you what, she is fantastic at what she does. I absolutely enjoy the music she puts out with the video games. I'm a patron. I get early access to them. They're marvelous. They are absolutely marvelous. So, Amie, thank you so much. How are you today?
I'm doing good.
Good. I'm glad
Good
to
to
hear
be
that.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we've known each other for quite a few years, mostly online, but which is weird because we live kind of in the same city.
Yeah.
um, but for those that don't know you, why don't you share a little bit of your story, kind of where you're at, who you are, how you got to be where you are? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's always hard to know where to start a
Mm-hmm.
story, That's always my hardest point. But I think to go back to the days when I was a youth group student at an evangelical Assemblies of God church, and I felt this feeling it was at a summer camp where the summer camp was put on and sponsored by North Central University. And it just so happened that I felt God call me to North Central University. It was the wildest thing. Who could have thought it? And I was really, really passionate about music. And I went to Bible college and studied music and was planning to be a youth pastor, and then decided that wasn't for me. And that was where the beginnings of like the ongoing process of deconstruction and reconstruction were really, really built up for me, was at Bible college. Came home from that after 2 years to marry my partner. And we started a house church community called Mosaic, which was the attempt was to be as open and accepting of people no matter where they are in life or their spirituality, and to find something resembling truth through having conversations and sharing meals and connecting. Did that for a couple years, and eventually around the time that our son Mark was born, we decided we didn't want to live. This was all in Illinois. We decided we didn't want to live in Illinois, and that if we were going to move, we should do it now, because we knew one of us would probably be opening up a business. And we also knew that we didn't want our kid to have to move around once, he got his roots, once he had his group of friends and his community. We didn't want him to have to be uprooted from that. So we are another part of our family was also moving out.
Me?
Oh, say hi.
Hey. Hi.
Say hi, Atticus.
Hey, Atticus.
Can you go play?
You're so big.
He is. He makes several appearances on the podcast.
That's incredible. I love it. I would not be surprised if Mark sneaks up behind me. But if he does, he'll just sneak up and like wave and then run away. That's how he does guest appearances on this.
That's great.
But yeah, so we moved to Oregon because I had always wanted to live in Oregon, and we had other family who was kind of thinking about moving out here, so we all kind of moved together. So Mark would have some cousins to grow up with, and it just kind of all worked out. And living out here, I decided to start pursuing music as my job. That's when I started making YouTube videos. And I also, at the time, was promoting an album that I was for sure going to have released through a label. That someone who contacted me on SoundCloud with an awesome plan for their label. Turned out they were a scam artist, and they were trying to steal money from me. But when I said, I don't want you to master my album, I'll hire someone to do it, they stopped talking to me. So thankfully I didn't fall for their scam. They didn't get anything from me. I just kind of crushed my hope on having an album released through a label, but that's fine. I also was playing live gigs, and I was doing some busking or playing on the side of the street because that's really popular in Portland. And busking was soul crushing. I just could not handle it. And playing live gigs doing the whole grind in live performances where you play the open mics and then you get the midnight, like the midweek show, and then eventually you're opening for the weekend shows, and then eventually you're playing the weekend shows. It just didn't work with my life as a parent, and you know, having a full-time life at home where I wanted to be with my family. It just wasn't something I felt like doing. And YouTube, I could keep doing. I could make videos every week from home, and that kind of became my life over the course of many years. Was this process of every week, or now every other week, picking a song that I want to cover from a video game or a TV show, putting my spin on it, filming the whole process while I'm recording, and then turning it into a music video. And that's kind of what I've been doing since then. My faith has developed in a lot of unique and interesting ways. I thought about putting in my little bio that you want me to write something along the lines of like, the only thing I can think of was like my Facebook status for my relationship is with faith is it's complicated, because it's complicated.
Yeah.
But right now I'm a part of a United Methodist congregation in Portland. It's called the Southeast Portland Parish. I kind of head a ministry known as Snack Church, which we're currently doing on Zoom, and the goal is to provide spiritual practice for people wherever they are in life. Again, I'm a big fan of creating spiritual space for people regardless of what they believe or if they believe anything or where they are. So what we do is each week we take a text, and that text can be a quote from a film or a song, and we go through it and we try to find some nugget of truth that resonates with us through conversation and you know, using some repetition, stuff like that. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm doing that every week with my people on Zoom. I'm making music. And also last year, I realized that I should probably change my name to Amie because I'm trans, and that's a whole other part of my story that I completely forgot about. I made a whole album about it. It's a big deal. But that also happened. We can talk about that. I'm super open with my story. So
Sure. I've actually appreciated how open you've been with your story, like through Facebook and through everything, and just kind of sharing your triumphs, and sharing your ups and some of your lows, but just everything, just being honest about it. And I really appreciate that. So I'm curious. I mean, music is a passion of yours. Like it's not just a hobby. It's a like a passion, and I can tell. Um, how has your faith embodied itself in music?
Well, I find that music is something that I use to process everything in my life. Like I said, my most recent album, Cosmos of the Soul, is very much a story of my journey to discovering who I was and discovering my gender identity and such as that. That was my way of processing that experience through music. And I have used music for music has been my conduit to all sorts of really big things in life. I feel like the biggest things are, they're hard to express simply in words, you know, and that's where arts come in for me. It's like, I believe that, you know, I think on a personal level, when I think of my relationship with spirituality, faith, God, and music, I think first of, I made an album called Duality a few years ago. That was very much me processing a series of faith crises through music. And it's ultimately about balancing the mystic and the cynic inside of myself. That there's a deeply skeptical human being in me that wants proof and rationality, and then there's also a part of me that deeply loves the inherent mystery that surrounds us. And these two ideas, living with both of them, can feel at times very can feel very conflicting, right? But then there's also a part of me that kind of leans into like I guess kind of like a Peter Rollinsian approach of like live in the conflict, find the struggle and dive into it, sort of a thing. And that's kind of what that album is meant to represent, is how through that duality in me, I come to some understanding of the non-understanding that is faith. And so that's like on a more direct level. That was an album that I made that was about faith. I've also I used to do worship music a lot back in the day. I do it less now, but I do bring some music to church. At least back when we could meet in person, I would show up and play piano and sing songs and do those kind of things. But I think on a grander level, as I was saying, like if you look back on the history of artistic expression through plays and films and more traditional art and music, you see again and again the processing of these deep questions, these questions that are like at the heart of the human experience, these questions that don't really have concrete answers, or if they do, we're constantly rethinking them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's such like a holy process, to that like art is an essential part of like processing the deeper questions in life. And it's in the processing of that, maybe not even finding an answer, but just wrestling with the question, representing the question, showing the conflict that shows up within that question through art. That is super holy work in my mind. So I feel like that's a big part of it for me, is music is creation. Creating art is, whether it's deep art or shallow art, or, all art is art. And I think that all art in some way is a connection to the divine, because we're engaging in creation. We are also mm-hmm. creating. And I think when you try to, for me at least, when I'm really pure when I try to be really like have like a pure vision of what creation for creation's sake is, like there's something really beautiful in that, where it's like I'm not making this for anyone necessarily, but I'm also making it in the hopes that someone will hear it and connect with me. Right. But it's like I'm making this to make it, and when you really do that, there's something really, really deep there that I think for me connects with, like, I guess, creation in general, like the ongoing nature of creation. So.
Yeah. Do you think that creation process brings something tangible to the divine that we wouldn't have without it?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like in a lot of ways, and I guess I can just say this, for at least from my personal experience, I have probably felt the most directly connected to the divine, the biggest, like, unshakable moments are the ones that I like to point to. Those ones that, like, there's a lot of stuff in my previous spirituality that I can kind of, convince myself, like, okay, that was probably this or that, or, right. There's a lot of, I was deep in hard Pentecostal evangelical Christianity. And there's a lot of stuff that I don't believe was God that I used to believe was God. Like I was a speaking in tongues person, and I have a lot of conflicting feelings about that now, as someone who doesn't really believe I was doing much more than having a really powerful emotional moment. Right. Which is fine. Emotional moments are good too. They can be powerful. Sometimes you're in such a deep emotional state, you just want to shut your logic brain off and just have sound happen. And that's, maybe you saw someone else making that sound happen, and it kind of sounds like the thing you're doing, and that becomes a tradition in your church. That's fine. It's beautiful. I don't want to, I see some of the beauty in it. But for me, there was a really stark, like, I don't think that was actually God necessarily. Right. And there's a lot of those, but I feel like the ones that are really unshakable are when I think about the first time I heard Sigur Rós, however you want to pronounce it, their album, it's just two parentheses, which I still to this day is one of, like, the most important spiritual albums to me of all time. It's mostly instrumental. The lyrics are all sung in Hopelandic, which is a language that Yancey made up. It's like meant to be like using voice as an instrument. and there is something powerful and tangible represented in that album. And regardless of the necessarily, like, I don't think it has anything really to do with the um the the goal of like the band making it, or, you know, the artist intention, right? There's just something that shows up when art moves you, and I think that there's something that is very much like the divine becoming more tangible, this like inherently untouchable, unfathomable reality that's like, to me, the only way I can even continue to have faith is to acknowledge that it's something beyond truth. Like it is essence that exists outside of all of the frameworks of what things that exist I understand, right? This is something beyond that, but it's also something that I see manifest, and absolutely one of the places I see it manifest really beautifully is through the emotions that can be communicated through art, music, film, all of those things.
Yeah, I agree. I feel the same way. There's something about like it's one thing about like certain chord structures and progressions elicit moods, and those can be manipulated. Like that's one thing. But talking about like the feelings that you get when it connects with something and transcends yourself and the art into something else, it does bring in those big wide truths that are untangible, intangible, untalkable about. They just are, and it makes them a little more real. I'm curious, you said that you're really open about your transition story.
Yeah.
um I'm curious the role that art played in that.
Yeah, it played a pretty huge role, actually. I did I'm actually a part of a it's a pretty large research. The reason I kind of smiled when you mentioned that is because I did a series of like 4 or 5 like 2.5 hour interviews with another friend of mine who's doing a research paper on like the intersection of like marginalized identity and art and music.
Oh wow.
And we talked a lot about where my YouTube channel and music and my gender journey intersect, and where my original music and my like experience of gender intersect, and how music played a role in my transition and my self-discovery. So it's something I've actually thought a lot about because I've had like about 8 hours of conversation with a very good friend about it. So yeah, when I guess we could just go back to last year. Last year in late May, my partner, AJ, had mentioned that they wanted to um, kind of explore their understanding of their gender. And I was like, that's awesome. That's super great. My partner, AJ, by the way, we both kind of came out together at the same time and kind of went through a very, very similar, but also very different journey at very, like pretty closely aligned. It's mostly because I saw what they were doing and was like, oh shit, this is something for me too. Oh no.
Yeah.
And there's actually a lot of like, I hope I'm not like piggybacking on your thing. You know, I didn't want it to feel like I was taking any attention away from their experience of understanding themselves. But they currently are, you know, they're a non-binary transmasculine person who uses they them pronouns. Um, and so they started this like exploration of like kind of putting the foot in the water of like, maybe I can break gender conventions a little more, and that's okay. And I was like, yeah, maybe I might too, if you're okay with that. And at the time, my brain was totally convinced that it was just cool fashion, that I realized I didn't need to follow the rules of who's allowed to wear what, and that's fine. And that's all it was. It wouldn't mean anything else. I could be a guy who likes to wear cute dresses. Like, that's fine. And that is fine. Yeah. It's 100% fine. I think very much that like the expanding and the deconstruction of gender roles is super good and healthy. The queering of gender is incredible. Like, I love and I felt like really inspired by people who say, I don't care what anyone says about what I am or am not allowed to wear. I'm just going to wear what I like.
Yeah.
And I feel like I started my journey with that. And then I saw myself in the mirror for the first time with this like really cute fox dress that I had. And there was this spark of joy that's deeper than just, I like this fashion. And it was so terrifying that it immediately sent me into about a month of just spiraling panic and then doubt and then like trying to convince myself that it was nothing and then feeling that really strong joyous feeling of euphoria and then it would spiral again. It was terrifying. It's what a lot of trans people will call the time when they're an egg, which is where you're not really ready to self-identify. You're not quite ready to admit to yourself, to come out to yourself. And I think it was really intense for me because I went from having what I now call like gender apathy. Like I didn't have any connection to my gender. It was just a nothing thing. I was gender apathetic to having this really strong connection with gender that was super brought on by, the last couple of years leading up to that moment. I had been doing a ton of work in therapy, working on learning to love myself, which was like the thing that I realized a few years before. I was like, I can't say I like myself. That's a problem. I should probably talk to my therapist about that. And after like 3 weeks of talking to my therapist, she asked me to say good things about myself, and I couldn't. And that was when it really was like, okay, we're going to start doing some of this hard work. So to kind of give some context before I get to the actual question you asked, which is about music. I feel like for me, one of the beauties of my gender, of my understanding of my gender and the discovery of who I was that it came, the work that came first was the work of learning to love myself. And then when I came to love myself, I realized that the thing that stopped me from loving myself kind of arrested my development as a person around the time I started going to that youth group that I mentioned at the beginning. Like, because I was a super sensitive teenager who was super afraid of hurting other people and felt like I was a bad person all the time. And then I went to a youth group that was like, that's good, actually. It's good to think you're terrible because that's good theology. So you are terrible, and it's because you're terrible that Jesus is good. And so that theology, I just jumped on it. I was like, yeah, a church that tells me that all these feelings I have about myself are actually good, cool. I'm all about that. And I had to, work. That's trauma. That's trauma I had to process. And so I process it, and I kind of think of it as like soil that was like super just ravaged. It was like, salted and gross, and you can't grow anything in it. And I went through that work over several years of tilling that soil, of eventually bringing it back to the place that something could grow in it again. Yeah. And then stuff started to grow. And I realized, I came out in 2018 as being bisexual because I was like, oh, this is something that's in me that I didn't realize was in me. And it wasn't, maybe there's a lot of conversations happening about the more subtle forms of closeting where like, it's not like you felt like you were actively putting yourself or hiding who you were, but being in a culture where, having these feelings is always portrayed negatively and is always portrayed as something the out group does, that in itself forces things to never grow. And that is a form of closeting, And so I kind of feel like that was my experience. And I was so unaware of these things as they start appearing out. I was like, oh, it would feel as though it was appearing out of nowhere. Like, whoa, I didn't even realize this part of me. And, that's a scary thing in this world, especially with a lot of the bad messaging that's out there from people who are, transphobic. I think that's the only word I can think of is transphobic. Is like,
it's a good word for it.
Yeah, is that there's this lie of like rapid onset gender dysphoria is bad, and you're just going to change your mind after 6 months because how could you possibly and when I'm looking at it going like, I have felt nothing about this for 32 years of my life, and I just turned 32, and suddenly I have all of these feelings about gender that I've never had before. Yeah. And I realized looking back on it was that I just never allowed myself to I didn't have a connection to my identity. I didn't have a connection to gender because it was the wrong one. Like, I just kept saying, like, I don't really feel like I'm a boy or I'm a guy, so that means gender is stupid. And
Right.
I look back and I go, maybe I just didn't really feel like I was a guy because I wasn't a guy. Like,
Yeah.
and maybe if someone would have given me that option earlier, it wouldn't have felt so sudden, you know. But the point of all of that is that I came into it out of learning to love myself. And in the process of learning to love myself, I was able to start discovering new parts of myself. And I tried on these clothes, and it blew my mind. And then I went through this period of June or it was May, where I was just panicking all the time. It was May
Mhm.
and June. And it was in that space that I also decided that I was going to release a 5-song EP that was called Bisexual Space Magic. And it was going to be a big celebration that I was going to release on the 22nd of June, because that was the 1-year anniversary of when I came out as bi. It was going to be a big free album that I was going to give away for Pride. And it was going to be fun, happy dance music that's just celebratory for Pride Month.
Mhm.
And very quickly, that EP became something much, much, much deeper, because it was in my studio that I was able to see myself for the first time. Because I'm in an attic studio, and I tend to have these, you can kind of see there's like black curtains up on the windows. So there's like, no one can really see into my studio when I'm working. And I was, you know, I was in this place still of panic. I really hadn't come out to myself even yet. At the very least, I was saying things like, I'm probably gender queer, maybe. I don't know. I'm figuring it out. I don't know if I want new pronouns. I don't know if I want to change my name. I don't know. I probably
Yeah.
won't do any of that. And all of, you know, I had some trans friends who were trying really, really hard to not be like, oh, honey. Because here's the thing, there are people who were in that place where I was, and then they do realize that, you know what, genderqueer is the perfect word for me, and I'm totally fine with
Yeah.
keeping my pronouns, and that's beautiful. But I feel like they could connect with some of my journey and be like, I know where you're at, and I see it. I
Yeah.
see it in you. And so it was in my studio making the 5 songs on that album that I just felt aligned. Because I would wear the clothes I wanted to wear, and I would feel really right in my studio, making music, connecting with the music. The music was very reflective of how I felt on the inside, this like joyous feeling inside of me. And so that EP became an album that was about self-discovery, that was about allowing yourself to go on a journey into what I wrote in the description of that EP was, go on a journey into the cosmos of your soul and find who you are. Um,
Mhm.
and that's what that album was for, that EP. And that was ultimately what made me go, okay, I need to expand this 5-song EP into a 15-song album that is Cosmos of the Soul. And that became the story of my journey as told through a science fiction story about exploring space. So yeah, music has been a huge part of this journey.
Yeah.
It's been really wonderful.
That's great. I love that you have almost a record of your journey. I mean, a literal record of your journey. But
Yeah.
but you have this record of your journey through this art that you've been creating. You can see yourself develop and see where you hit that sweet spot where you felt that yes to yourself, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering about self-discovery. I'll be honest. When it comes to genderqueer and trans people, in some ways I'm jealous because they've done this work of discovering themselves that I haven't done with myself yet. I'm sort of in process of doing that in some ways with my therapist because, like you, I imbibed a lot of glorious theology that ends up being feeding into trauma that was already there,
Mhm.
and I need to undo that. But that self-discovery piece, I think anyone can relate to if they're serious about it.
For sure.
And I'm wondering, how has self-discovery let you feel what you believe, whatever spirituality it is? How does it let you feel that in your body?
Well, I know for me, and I think this is going to take self-discovery kind of back to my specific trans experience, but I
Mhm.
did want to quickly say, like, a big part of all of my messaging around Cosmos of the Soul was that I wanted it to both be very explicitly my story,
Mhm.
but also a universal story. And that,
Yeah.
so because of that, like, it was always a really hard thing to think about, like when I was writing, you know, like copy for it, or when I was like trying to come up with promotional material for it, I'll be like, you know, like, I don't want to just say like it's a trans album, because it is, but it also isn't, because
Yeah.
I genuinely believe that what like I went through is something that is universal, and I think it's good and beautiful, and all people should be. um for me it was kind of, uh you know, like I said, it was awakened in me through therapy, but then it became, you know, I realized how deep the cosmos within us is because I had this whole part of me that I didn't realize. And
Yeah.
not everyone's journey has to be quite so dramatic, or, you know, like, you know, I ended up completely going from being a, you know, a very thick bearded dude who, all my, you know, my name was attached to all of my music, and it's still out there. Like all of my old music, I have chosen to keep under my name, which was Ace Waters, because for me, I don't think of it so much as a dead name. I think of it as like a, just, it's, this is my new name. I kind of grew into this new name, and that
Hmm.
part of my life, just like the part of my life before that where I made music under the name Motive Makes a Man, and the music before that where I was going by The Lonely Doodle, like all of these names represented a stage of my life. So why not
Hmm.
have the time that I was making music as Ace be the time I was making music as Ace? um but that, I went off on a super tangent from everything that you were asking.
That's
um
okay.
but the point of, I think, all of that was that um self-discovery is, should 100% be, and I think is a beautiful universal thing that, you know, cisgender and transgender and non-binary and all beautiful people should go through a deeper, a constant process of trying to understand yourself better. I think it is something that is, if more people did this process, I think we'd live in a much different world. I think that we lose track of who we are, and it's really good to check in with yourself and to try to make sure that you're being true to yourself, and that you are, you know, not, if there's something in you, I think for me it's always, the thing should always be chasing joy. That's the spark of joy is what led me to where I am right now. Like
Yeah.
I embrace she her pronouns because my pastor kind of just offhandedly said like, oh yeah, and she blah 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 blah, and she was the first person to call me she. Like she was the first person to use that language for me, and my
Yeah.
heart exploded when I heard it. It was like the most powerful moment. It was one of the most powerful moments of my life. And I was like, all right, I can't deny this. That's what I want. Like, obviously. And it was very similar with my name. There just came a point where I was like, no, this is what brings joy. This is what, you know, I'm chasing that light inside of me, that light of alignment, that makes me feel euphoria, that makes me feel right with things. And that's super beautiful. And to kind of come finally back to the question you were asking, um, my understanding of myself, I I never understood the phrase, you know, like the language of, you know, fearfully and wonderfully made, or, you know, beautiful creation, or like it was a theology that I embraced abstractly after I kind of deconstructed a lot of the fallen state, you know, sinful to the core theology that
Hmm.
did a lot of damage to me. And I came out of it with this much more like, look at all the language in the creation poems, that's about like how good creation is, how wonderful
Yeah.
creation is. Like that is something really cool. And I did a lot of study into like different theologies, and learned a lot about Eastern Orthodox theology, which talks a lot about um, you know, sin and holy being states, as it's a totally different way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
That like, you know, that your core, it kind of flips it on its side. And I don't want to like misrepresent Eastern Orthodoxy, because I haven't done, it's been a long time since I did this study, but the thing that I always took away from it was that it was more that at the core, your truest self is your holy self. And as your holy self goes through the world weighs you down with all of the things in the world. And that's so real. Like, you don't have to have a belief in Christianity to believe that. And I remember when my son was born, that was like, if I think I was already pretty done with original sin, but when my kid was born, I was like, no, we're done. You cannot tell me that this perfect being that has done nothing wrong with the world, like, is evil until something happens to it, because your understanding of Jesus isn't strong enough or cool enough that it needs us to be bad to be good. Like, nah, fuck that. That's not for me. That's all, like, I had this theology of, like, beautiful creation. We are holy. We are good. God sees the goodness in us and wants us to be our best selves. Like, that was abstractly there for years. But if you asked me if I thought God liked me,
no,
that was never something that I could personalize. I could never relate that to myself. And I think I just dealt with it by not dealing with it. Like, I just didn't talk about it, and I never really engaged with it. And, it's kind of like when the therapist said, can you say nice things about yourself? And I went, no, I'm about to cry because you're asking me to. This is too hard. And it was a very similar feeling to that when at some point after coming out to my church family, and we were doing the snack church thing, but we were doing it in person. And I had brought a piece for us to discuss, and it was the song, what's it called? Is it called The Call? It's a Regina Spektor song that was featured in one of the Chronicles of Narnia films.
Okay.
And it's like, it started out as a feeling and then grew into a hope and then grew into a quiet thought that grew into a quiet word. It's this beautiful, beautiful piece. And it was like my theme that, like, resonated really deeply within me, because that was how I felt my journey was this feeling. And I chased that feeling, and it grew stronger and stronger.
Mm-hmm. And
somewhere in that, someone mentioned something about, like, how much, like, it was one of those spiritual phrases about us being, loved by God, or being, beautiful, beloved creation, something like that.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I personalized that. And I literally couldn't personalize that until I came out to myself and to other people. And I have gone through so many phases in my faith. And there was a time where I could tell you that I believed I had, like, a direct personal relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a long time where God was this abstract collection of, at the very least, axioms that connected me to a reality beyond reality that was ultimately representative of some philosophy of understanding that there are things beyond us. And that was the best I could say about God. And for a long time in that space, I didn't have a very close, feely connection to God, but I had this close connection to these unshakable moments. And that was ultimately what kept me with the label Christian.
Mm-hmm.
But once I came out and once I started living into myself, I felt like that allowed that closeness to come back. And that's been super real for me. Like, I have never felt so connected and it's hard to explain because it's a different feeling than it was in youth group, but it's super real. It's just like, yeah, I feel loved by God. I don't think I could ever say that before, and now I do. And there's a tangibleness to that you can't put it into words, but it's there. And so for me, like, it's one of those really interesting things, because I know there are people in my past who would probably tell me that embracing who I am as a trans woman is like going against God. But to me, embracing who I was as a trans woman was like the thing that brought me probably the closest in a metaphysical sense to a relational God than I've been in ever.
Yeah.
And it's also still mystical and weird, and it's not. That's why I say it's complicated.
Yeah.
I still don't know exactly. I couldn't tell you what I believe, but I can tell you what I've experienced and what I've felt, and my traditions and my understandings of what is good for humanity and what, what brings us together and what Christianity should be. And I think that's enough to keep me going.
Yeah.
And somewhere in there, though, is this like holy spark of joy that reconnects me with something bigger than myself. That
Oh, that's
was
beautiful.
100% connected to my understanding of myself.
That's beautiful. That really is. I resonate with that a lot. Just in my own, like I said, my own therapeutic journey into myself, and how that it doesn't just change my understanding of God, it changes the way that I relate to my understanding of God. It does this thing, and I can say I feel God in ways that I haven't before, just like you were saying. But it's because I'm getting to know myself in a very positive way for the first time. So I completely relate with what you're saying. Completely. Um, okay, so this is my favorite question to ask everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely relish asking this question. So, in light of what we've talked about, in light of art and the tangibleness of faith through art, and in light of self-discovery and your journey and all of this, what does this do to your articulation of the gospel?
Can you? I'm worried that it's vague enough that I could go too far off. Could you clarify just a little bit?
Sure. We all believe good news. And for those of us that are Christian, we believe a good news that is proclaimed by Jesus. The way that we articulate that good news changes with different circumstances in our lives, different understandings that we have.
Okay.
But if you're going to articulate that, I'm not talking evangelize, I'm not talking quote unquote witness to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody asks you, why do you have hope? Somebody asks you,
Yeah.
what is good news to you? What does all that we've talked about do to your articulation of that good news?
Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure. Yeah. So I think my understanding of articulating good news, of speaking gospel, started in that place that was very much evangelizing. It was convincing people. And while I was always suspect of street evagelism, even when I was the deepest in the cult, so to speak, when I was like
Yeah.
fully in it, I was going to an Assembly of God Bible school, I was believing it all. I had yet to have some of those really powerful deconstructing moments that came around in like my second year of Bible college. I still was like, but street preaching is stupid, right? Like, there is nothing that good that comes from this. We just look like crazies. We shouldn't do this. And my teacher, I actually had to take a class that was like a spiritual formation class. And a part of that, one of the things you had to do was evangelize. Like, it was built into the grade that me,
Oh, God.
as a music performance major, had to do to graduate from my collegiate school, my university. In order to get my undergraduate degree, I had to evangelize. And I wrote a whole thing about my part of that class. Was I wrote like a 3-page paper about why evangelism is stupid. And I somehow managed to pass. I think I got like a C in the class because they weren't super happy with that. But I'll say I always had kind of a like suspicion or a distrust of the more traditional forms of gospel sharing. But I also, like, one of the things I remember really strongly was I have one of my longest friends, one of the people I've known probably longer than most other than like family members. One of my oldest friends is Baha'i. And when we met, it was when we met, I wasn't in it. But once I started going to youth group, it was like my goal to convert him, because that's the goal. And if there was something you would say if I was speaking against street preaching, there was always the but relational evangelism. That's where it's at. Which now I look back on relational evangelism, and it's like pyramid scheme, see your friends as objects to sell to. It's even just more gross. But and I remember there was a long period where every conversation that we would end up having about spirituality would ultimately be me trying to convince him of why my beliefs were right and his beliefs were wrong. And looking back, I missed out on so many incredible conversations that we could be having about how each of us see faith, about what faith looks like in our lives, about what, learning a greater understanding of what this tradition of Baha'i is. Like, because to me, I heard like a couple buzzwords in a book that taught me why it's bad, and that's all that mattered to me.
Right.
I didn't know anything about the traditions or the writings, the writings of the Bab and the writings of Baha'u'llah, and how those, influenced this group of people, and how that became this really, really fascinating faith that has just astounding architecture, if anything else. Like their architecture is mind-blowing. I got to go to the temple. There's a temple in Chicago area that's just gorgeous. But the point of all this was that I was missing out on what I think now I would come much closer to what I would think is like a section of what I would consider good news or gospel, which was that spiritual discovery, that spiritual connection with another human being. I think about, I have another friend, and a friend who is deeply unreligious, like non-religious at all. Didn't grow up religious, has had very little interest in religion. And it's interesting because I always knew it as, there are two kinds of people. There's the religious people, and then there's the people who've been burned by religion, because I was the burned by religion one.
Right.
But there's a whole other group of people who are just spiritually like apathetic, because they're like, I never had it, I don't need it, it's fine, whatever. It seems like this weird thing that's happening over there. You do you. But I've also noticed that when I have deep conversations with people who just don't really have a deep connection with any kind of spirituality, they have their own like religious experiences. They have their own deep things. And for my one friend, for him, it was DMT. And if you don't, DMT is a really, really strong psychedelic. And it's found in ayahuasca, which is the traditional shamanistic hallucinogenic from South America. And somewhere chemists who are very, very smart figured out that you could crystallize it and make it super potent, and then you smoke that crystallized form of it, and it like skyrockets you out of the plane of existence, out of your own body, and you're like spiraling through eyeball like buildings. And it's like, if you've ever seen a Tool album cover, that's DMT tried to be
that is the best way of describing DMT I have ever heard. It's a Tool album cover. That is,
well, because like the guy who makes most of the new Tool album art is like smokes DMT and then makes art. Like that's actually what he's doing. Which is really interesting. And honestly, there's I have a whole bunch of stuff about how, like, if you read the descriptions of angels in the Old Testament, they sound an awful lot like Tool album art, which sounds an awful lot like DMT trips.
They do.
Like eyeballs everywhere. But the point with this was, when my friend talks about his experiences on DMT, there is a profound connection with some sort of spiritual reality beyond us that changed his life, like profoundly. And there are people who are scared of me saying something like that, because it's like, like my path to spirituality is the right path, and you're getting real close to the all spokes lead to the same circle. But I'm like, just throw the whole wheel out. Like, we are talking about love transcendent that is embodied in some like metaphysical non-reality, like transcendent thing that is reality without reality. Like, how on earth do you think that like your 1920s moralistic interpretation of an older tradition that you know very little about because you only know these like 4 or 5 writers and they're everything to you.
Yeah.
Like, so you're not even looking at the whole scope of your own orthodoxy, let alone other people's encounters with the divine. Like, and you think that that gives you a deep enough understanding to tell everyone else that their understandings are bad? Like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
So to me, like, there is a gospel moment that I have when my friend gets to experience a touch of that thing beyond us, and we get to talk about it for hours. We're sitting at the bonfire for hours just discussing like this beautiful feeling, this connection to something beyond us. And so on in a very abstract, more, there's I think my most base level of good news is having conversations and helping people to discuss and learn and connect with their own spiritual experiences, whether those are traditionally religious or not, because spirituality and connection with like the divine is so powerful, and it transcends culture, and that is a level of good news that I think is 100% gospel and good. And then there is a gospel that I believe a wicked cool rabbi named Yeshua was preaching, and a bunch of people wrote about him, and he was so radical at his time. And when you look at the story that is told through these books that have made it through the ages, and you read it collectively, especially through the lens of that dude rather than the lens of Paul or the lens of all these other writers, when you really dive into that thing, you see there's a radical understanding of humanity, of our connection to each other, and of our connection to the divine. And that has been so unbelievably polluted and twisted and fucked up by American Christianity that, like, I hold to the title of Christian almost out of spite, to be like, no, you don't get to have the last word on what Christianity is. You don't get to tell everyone who Jesus was, because your Jesus sucks. And your Jesus, like, messed me up as a teenager, and your Jesus kills trans kids, and like your Jesus, that, like, and so there is a reclamation of what I still care about in my tradition, right? I'm not saying that my tradition is the tradition. Right. I can't possibly claim that. I think anyone who claims that is absurdly, like, egotistical. Yeah. But there is a reason why, like, I went to Bible college. I studied this thing. I can't not admit that this is my tradition. Yeah. And there's something beautiful in my tradition that keeps me to it. And it's so beautiful. This is my true, I think if you're really, what is my good news? It's that beautifulness within Christianity that I care so much about, that I'll stick with Christianity, even though Christianity has become, at least in my corner of the world, something utterly devoid of that beauty. But that beauty is important enough that I'm willing to fight for it. I'm willing to, the only thing I can think of is, like, I don't know have you seen the latest season of Queer Eye?
I have not. I don't watch too much TV because I'm lazy to fight for it in my household. Everybody else steals the TV from me, so
that's fair. In the latest season of Queer Eye, there's a gay pastor who is like the person who gets made up, and there's a whole conversation we could have about Queer Eye. I don't want to have that conversation right now. It's complicated. I get it. There's some issues with it, but it's also, it makes me cry every time I watch it. And the moment in that episode was when he was speaking with a couple of other queer pastors, one of whom was non-binary, and they said, the thing that I think he said was, like, I want my church, I don't want anyone to have to go through what I went through as a kid in their churches. And that just, it broke me. It's like, that's why I'm still doing this. Yeah. Because I think that if you really look at the heart of this good news, it's safety. It's a place where you can be your true self, and, like, God can help you to be the best, most fullest version of who you are that you can be. And churches should be places where, like, LGBTQ plus people feel the safest, not the places that they're terrified of. Like, churches should be places that are standing, like, very directly on the side of, you know, protesters who are demanding justice in our world, not
Yeah.
driving their cars with their back the blue signs through my city and causing all sorts of chaos. Like, you know,
Yeah.
in a world where patriot prayer exists, I feel even stronger the need to hold fast to the title Christian, because there's something so beautiful in this that I think can, you know, can and should be redeemed, even if it's been so fucked up that maybe we need a period of time where maybe there's less Christianity in the world. um,
That's
but I also
beautiful.
believe that good news can exist without Christianity, and I know that's also, that can be contentious for people. But like my one of my pastors and I, we've talked a lot about just looking at the state of the church, and will the
Mhm.
church be what the church is now in America in 20, 30 years?
Yeah.
Like if we look at projections and attendance numbers, probably not.
Yeah.
Churches are closing down pretty quick. But we're both like, but she always tells the story of, she went to go see Lady Gaga perform, and she was like, and she was up there preaching gospel to these
Mm.
kids, and they were singing along. And so I have no doubt that the truth of the gospel will live on even if Christianity dies. Like, God's big enough for that. And that, I know that's pretty radical for a lot of people, but for me, there's just, that is 100%. Like, I don't necessarily need Christianity for gospel, but there is something beautiful in my tradition that I think is worthy of salvaging, and that is also gospel. And if the church doesn't want to listen and it fades into obscurity, I still think that truth will be out there.
Yeah.
So I
That's
think
absolutely beautiful.
God's big enough to deal with all of our bullshit.
Yes. There's the pull quote right there. God's big enough to deal with our bullshit. That is no. What you said, thank you for sharing that. That really meant a lot to me to hear. I appreciate that. Well, Amie, you have been an absolute pleasure. I would love to have you on again sometime if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Um, you're smart, and I appreciate what you have to say, especially relating it to yourself so well, and that self-discovery piece that really sat with me. Really, yeah. So thank you. So if people do want to find you, what's your YouTube channel? What's your Twitter? What's your Facebook? Whatever you have, how can people find you?
Yeah. So on Twitter, I'm Amie Waters Music. On most things, I'm Amie Waters Music. I'm not 100% sure if that's my YouTube URL because it's changed so many times, and I had to change everything over from my old name, and I forget if I got a new URL or not. I think I did. But if you just search Amie Waters, I'm the only one thing. My name is spelled AMIE, not AMY.
Yes.
There have been too many interviews I've done with people where I don't say that, or I say it at the very, very end, like right now. But yeah, if you look up AMIE WATERS music, MUSIC, that username on Twitter, on Instagram, I believe on Facebook, that will take you to my Facebook page. My Patreon is Amie Waters Music, patreon.com/Amie Waters Music.
Yeah.
And on YouTube, if you just search Amie Waters, my YouTube channel will come right up. There's 300 and something videos on there these days of all sorts of video game covers, TV show covers,
Mm-hmm.
movie themes. If any of that sounds appealing to you, especially if the idea of hearing those things on synthesizers sounds cool to you, my
It
studio,
is cool. It
you
is.
can't
It doesn't just sound cool. It is cool.
see if I can show off the pile of synths that's right here, and there's way more over here. So yeah, that's the main places that you can find me right now. I'm also, my album Cosmos of the Soul is on iTunes and Spotify and or I guess iTunes/Apple Music,
Mm-hmm.
Amazon Music, whatever Google is doing these days. I think they switched over to YouTube Music.
Yeah.
Um, and if you really want to support me, go to my Bandcamp, because Bandcamp's a great platform who supports artists the most. Um,
Very
all of
cool.
my original music is on Bandcamp. All of my cover music is mostly on iTunes and Spotify because it's a huge pain to license music for Bandcamp.
I understand.
But
Well,
original stuff,
I will put links to everything also in the show notes so people can find you really easy there, because you are worth finding. You're very talented. You're very smart. You're very articulate. and
I
I
appreciate
appreciate
it.
you spending the time with me. It's been an absolute joy.
It has. I always worry that I ramble and that the thought I start with and the thought I end with are just complete like word salad. But everyone tells me I'm articulate, so I'm trusting them.
You
Because to
are.
me, I
You are.
feel like I'm a rambling mess.
No, no, you are very articulate. You get there and you take us on a good journey, and I appreciate it. So,
Thank
well,
you for
Amie,
having
thank
me.
you again. And I will talk to you soon. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.